Hi everyone, my name is Carly and I am a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do other stuff. In this case, it's digital painting. I know, a little bit of a switch up on my intro. In this week's video, I'm going to be doing a more in-depth process video explaining anatomy and ink texture cross-hatching techniques done in Procreate, but I really do want to make a few points about anatomy and some stylistic choices I made with this drawing. So if you're interested in that, then definitely keep on watching. So when I start off any drawing, especially a figure drawing, I start with straight lines and I draw through the figure as if you're seeing through it, right? You can see I'm starting off with a very basic couple of triangles. You can see some squares going on. I'm not using a whole lot of curved lines. You'll also notice that I'm gauging the proportions by almost starting off with like a stick figure and measuring where do the joints come together in relation to other parts of the body. So this means, okay, I'm looking at my reference photo. The knee that is bent, I can see from the reference photo that it is meeting about at the halfway point on the other leg. So this is why I start out with very straight lines. Well, one of the reasons. There's many reasons, but nevertheless. And I'm using the joints as points of reference for the proportions in the body. You can see I'm even doing this in the cloth that she's holding. There's a curve right in the area by her arm, and instead of trying really hard to get the perfect curve, I literally just did a lot of quick lines to etch that out and create the curve. So there's a lot of straight lines still. It's not reliant on really soft edges. This might feel counterintuitive because, and I'm going to go on a rant right now, my apologies, but the tendency is I see round curve, soft thing, I'm going to make a curve. But then what happens typically is you tend to try and perfect that curve, and then you end up getting a lot of these hairy, hesitant lines, and you don't have a true intention or focus on the structure of the line that you're really creating. And what happens is you end up getting this contoured look on your drawing that feels very static and may not even be proportionately correct because you are so focused on drawing the outline of the subject rather than viewing the drawing as a sculpture. Instead of viewing it as drawing the outline of something and then making details, think of it rather as making a 2D sculpture, starting with the wireframe, putting on a base coat of clay, and once you get those basic shapes, that's when you start adding more of the refined forms and curves around it. Because if you focus too much on the curves and organic shapes and you end up doing just the outline of your subject, you're not going to get the true energy in a pose like this. With straight lines especially, you're able to make quick lines, and that really helps you create more of an animated posture to your figure. Now, something else that I do is apply a similar concept to fabrics. Like I said earlier, for that curve that is happening in the draped fabric she's holding, I focused more on creating straight lines for the structure and created really quick basic shapes that I saw, like triangles. I don't know if it's a stylistic choice or if it's just a weird habit of mine. I end up using a lot of triangles when I am creating the skeleton of my subject matter. I'm not sure why. I find that they work really well for creating forearms, making the calves on a leg. I use triangles really everywhere. I have no idea why. As you can see, I also applied a similar shape language to the wrinkles in her dress, and this helps so much with things like fabric, especially where it's very abstract, it's very organic, it's more free flowing. Using things like a straight line, triangles, or squares really help to force you to view this as a 3D object. And minimizing those curves helps your eyes to gauge and see this rather than some elusive thing from your imagination. It really helps with looking at it like a structured physical object. And this will give you a lot more control when you go into shading and lighting and viewing it as a physical subject. So as you can see now, I have curved lines now, obviously. Sticking to the basic shapes, straight lines, quick, confident lines with intention are very key when you're just making the sketch and the skeleton. But I just want to really stress the importance of that stage of a drawing, because that is quite literally the foundation of your drawing. And if you don't have a stable foundation, the tower is going to fall. Okay, that got really ominous, but I'm just letting you know. So once I have that structure established, then I go in this case, I'm going in with my line art. You know, you don't have to do this if you're doing a painting, obviously, but if you're doing line art or you're doing anything with ink, creating softer outlines with that rigid skeleton underneath, you have a lot of structure and 3D space going on there to give some realism to this thing you're trying to draw. Now when you add the details and the soft curves, now it looks like something that has structural integrity, is proportionate, realistic, feels real to you. With the way that I do cross-hatching in my ink work, I follow the contours of the figure. So what does that mean? Earlier when I said the word contour, what I really meant was the outlines. People tend to draw just like the outline of something, but what I mean about contours here is it's kind of like a topographic map. There's going to be valleys and mountains, you know, highs and lows, so the depth across the subject matter. So what I mean by my cross-hatching follows the contours is my line work that I cross-hatch with follows the form rather than using just flat lines. Now, it's not to say I don't ever use just flat lines to cross-hatch, but most of the time, my lines are going to be curved as I'm cross-hatching in the direction of where that form is going. So you can see here around the leg, there's going to be more cross-hatching that's kind of curved going around the calf. Same thing with this cloth that I'm shading right here. I'm going along with that curve, kind of thinking about, you know, if this was a texture and I was warping it around this object, how would it move and fold? Like, what would the perspective be? And I follow the perspective of the subject matter with my cross-hatching. This just gives a different finish than if you were to do totally flat lines to shade and highlight your artwork. It's just a different style. And then in Procreate, the brush that I used, so I use a combination of the Mercury ink brush, which is one of the first ones that are just default on Procreate here. So if you go to the brush menu and you go to inking, the first one, Mercury, that's what I use most of the time. I use that for my outlines and a lot of the specific areas I want to shade. But as you can imagine, that takes a very long time to crosshatch, especially on digital formatting where you can zoom in so much, and if you're as crazy as me, you zoom in so far and you could take hours and hours and hours to just shade something. You need to do that. So what I did was, instead I opted for pen called, how do you pronounce this? Thylacine? I'm not sure if I said that correctly. I'm sure I butchered it and you guys are screaming at me, but basically what this is a bunch of lines combined in one, and I use this to crosshatch. And what this does is, instead of getting one of those crosshatching brushes that tend to look kind of flat and they're more stylized looking, what this is, it's kind of like if you were to hold your hand with a bunch of pens at the same time and crosshatch. And this way I can go with the contours like I typically draw, but it has a lot more, I guess you could say, pens going all at once. This just saves me a lot of time because of my style that I like to use when I'm doing this type of shading. Like I said, doing the more stylized cross-hatching brushes, those do work. Don't get me wrong, they definitely work, but they don't work with how I like to cross-hatch. They don't really follow the contours like what I'm talking about. So those are the two brushes that I use. And as soon as I switched over to that brush, it saved me, oh my gosh, so much time. Then in areas where there's going to be really dark shadows, because I'm extra, I like having very high contrast artwork. In areas where there's going to be those deepest, darkest shadows, the darkest darks, I get the Mercury brush, but I make it really big and I just kind of enhance those areas so that the shadows there are even darker compared to all the other shadows. This is for areas where there's something directly making a cast shadow over another object, like the fabric bending behind the fairy's waist. In those areas, I definitely want it to be darker because there's going to be a cast shadow. So this really helps with providing that depth. For the most part, this piece is done. I did end up adding some banners and a quote on it, which I will be using as a design for some future merch that I'm designing. Super excited about that. I'm sorry I didn't get into anatomy so much in this video. I more so went over the basics of drawing, some helpful tips when measuring out proportions, and also my technique I use and brushes for crosshatch shading on Procreate. But if you guys would like a more in-depth series on anatomy, because anatomy, I could talk about that for a century and still have more to talk about, to be completely honest. If you guys want more of that kind of stuff, definitely leave a comment down below, especially if you're already subscribed. Yeah. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next week. Bye!